Exactly. Well, let's move on. Let's get into a bit of controversy here, Tom, because about 20 years ago, let me back up. This is a question from Craig Beard, who points out that nearly 20 years ago, N T Wright was quoted as saying, "I have friends who I am quite sure are Christians who do not believe in the bodily resurrection." At the time, his statement caused a bit of a stir, and more recently, one of my sons, who has read and appreciated N T Wright's books, brought it to my attention and expressed concern about it. My question is, does N T Wright still stand by what he said then, or has he changed his view over time? So, Tom, do you need to believe in a physical bodily resurrection, as you've argued in Resurrection of the Son of God, in order to be a Christian?
Thanks, Mike, and thank you to Craig for this question. And like all quotations taken out of context, in order to understand it, you have to go back into the context. And I think that the context came originally from a book which I wrote 25 years ago with my late lamented friend Marcus Borg, an American theologian and writer who he and I studied the same time in Oxford. We didn't actually know each other then, but we had the same teacher. And when we did meet, we had a lot in common and we became good friends. And I'm still in touch with his widow and so on. Maggie and I stayed with them and they with us. And so I got to know Mark quite well. Now, Mark had come from a very fundamentalist Lutheran background where you had to believe this and this and this and this and this, and he'd found it all completely deadening and didn't do anything for him and so on. And then he gave it all up. But then in early middle life, through a series of extraordinary spiritual experiences, he came back into faith, and Jesus became enormously important to him, and his prayer life took off again. But because he had been kind of bullied as a young person by a kind of dogmatic, you've got to believe this, that, and the other, he had got into the position where anything like bodily resurrection, that was simply unspiritual. He was basically some kind of a Christian Platonist, and there have been many, many Christian Platonists who just don't think that the body matters that much. And Mark and I, one time when we were writing this book together, we were talking about prayer, and Mark told me quite humbly and quietly about his practice when he said he suffered from insomnia from time to time. And I said, so what do you do if you can't sleep? And he said, I pray my own version of the Jesus prayer with the rhythm of my breathing. I lie there and I'm praying, Lord Jesus Christ, you are the light of the world. Fill my mind with your light and my heart with your love. And I'll never forget that, the thought of him praying that. Lord Jesus Christ, you are the light of the world. Fill my mind with your light and my heart with your love. Now, someone who prays like that and someone who is earnestly acclaiming Jesus as the light of the world and seeking to make Jesus truth and life, his own truth and life, I want to say this man is a Christian. So why didn't he believe in the bodily resurrection? I want to say he's a muddled Christian. And I suspect that Marcus would probably have said the same about me. Tom, you're muddled because you think that the body actually matters. And I would say, well, yeah, that's because I think the whole Judeo-Christian worldview is about God loving bodies and resurrecting bodies and doing new creation. But where Marcus was coming from personally, pastorally, theologically, that was a bridge he was never going to cross. I have known other people cross that bridge. So I have in my mind a category of muddled Christian. And I don't want that to sound patronizing, because I know when people come from difficult backgrounds, often there are things they just can't get their heads around. Marcus would say, I believe Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And he would then say, I just don't think this involved his body. And so I would say we need to talk about the meaning of the word resurrection in the first century. And he and I would go around the tracks having that conversation. And it was out of conversations like that that I wrote my big book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. So I want to say normal Christian life involves believing that God raised Jesus bodily from the dead. But there are many people who are earnestly seeking Jesus and acclaiming him as the light of the world or as their Lord for whom that penny hasn't dropped yet. And so I was not prepared to say that Marcus Borg praying like that was not a Christian, but I would say and did say, and I would tease him about it, that I think he was a muddled Christian, and that I would love and hope and pray that he would come through that muddle. I don't think Marcus ever did. Does that mean in the great last assize that God will say this to him or that to him? That's God's business. But someone praying that prayer, I was not prepared to say this man is in no sense a Christian.
Yeah, I remember the obituary that F.F. Bruce wrote for Rudolf Bultmann.
Oh, really?
F.F. Bruce was a very famous evangelical scholar of the mid to late 20th century, wrote a lot of great commentaries, and Rudolf Bultmann was was the very definition of German liberal Protestant theology, and Bultmann didn't have much time for the resurrection either. But if you look at the eulogy that F.F. Bruce wrote of Rudolf Bultmann, and because they'd been at two European conferences together and they knew each other, even F.F. Bruce believed that there was a real faith in Rudolf Bultmann that was worth commending. So, yeah, I mean, it's the issue, like, how much do you need to get right in your theology to be saved? And, where do you get excluded? And how muddled can your faith be before it's become derivative, or it's a somewhat different gospel or different faith? I guess that's what some of the questions that people are worried about. But maybe the answer itself is not often as precise as we would like it to be, even for those of us who do believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you've got the reference, Mike, for that obituary by Bruce on Bultmann, I'd love to see it sometime. But that's exactly right. Paul says, if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Those are the promises. Now, if somebody confesses that Jesus is Lord, but wants to say that when Paul says God raised him from the dead, what that meant was a purely spiritual thing, I would say that's a classic 20th century muddle, invoking Platonism accidentally. Many, many people have been struggling to follow Jesus with that muddle in their heads. Are they therefore not real followers of Jesus? When you get to know them, maybe you want to say, like I would say of Mark Borg, that this man is really invoking the living Lord Jesus. Just that there's a bit of a huge intellectual muddle way back somewhere.
Yeah, I remember there was a debate also about the New Zealand biblical scholar Murray Harris. He wrote a book on the resurrection, Raised Immortal, and he had to be investigated by his own institution because they were worried he may have gone a bridge too far, you might say, when it comes to explaining the resurrection. So a number of scholars can, maybe say things that are a bit confusing or raise a lot of questions about what they are saying and they're not saying.
And that's a risk we all take. And unless we are simply going to repeat word for word what truly orthodox people have said before us, and I don't believe that's the task. Each generation has to be thinking afresh, and that is always a risk which we all face. But there's a difference here, which you highlighted, between is this person in some meaningful sense a Christian, and is this person somebody who you would trust with teaching in the church? Now, if I, as a bishop, had been approached by somebody with Marcus Borg's views and say, would you ordain me? I would say, actually, no, because this is part of the core teaching of the church, and you may have all sorts of opinions, but until we've sorted this one out, we're not going to get you ordained. And interestingly, William Temple, who I quoted in answer to a previous question, when he was a young man, he was basically a Platonist. He wasn't sure at all about the bodily resurrection, and he delayed ordination till he'd thought that one through and reached the conclusion that Jesus really was bodily raised from the dead. That was a major point. He knew it was wrong to get ordained if he hadn't got clear on that. So that there is a major distinction then between somebody who we say, they probably are a Christian, and somebody who we say, we entrust this person with a teaching role in the church.
Okay, interesting stuff.